My mother-in-law hid my husband's will from me. The church felt cold, despite the hundreds of people packed into the wooden pews. I stood there, Eliana, a widow of only 3 days, watching the flickering candlelight dance against my husband's mahogany casket. My heart was a heavy stone in my chest, but my eyes were fixed on her. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, stood at the very front, like a queen guarding a throne she had waited years to reclaim. She didn't look like a grieving mother. She looked like a woman who had just won a long, silent war. She wore a black veil that covered her eyes, but I could feel her gaze tracking every person who walked by. She didn't offer me a seat beside her. She didn't even acknowledge that I was the woman who had cared for her son through every hospital visit and every sleepless night. To her, I was just an obstacle that had finally been moved out of the way. The air smelled of lilies and betrayal. After the service, the reception was held at the old Whitmore estate. The house was filled with the low hum of voices and the clinking of expensive china. I sat in the corner, nursing a cup of tea I couldn't drink, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Beatrice. She leaned down, her perfume smelling like sharp roses and old secrets. She didn't offer a hug. Instead, she whispered right into my ear, her voice as smooth as silk and as cold as ice. "You'll be fine, Eliana, dear," she said, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "You should start looking for a small apartment soon. Julian didn't leave much behind anyway. It's best you move on before things get difficult." I pulled away, staring at her in total disbelief. Julian was a successful man who loved me deeply. The idea that he left me with nothing was a lie I could feel in my bones. I stayed awake all night in our bedroom, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Beatrice's words. Julian had owned 2 large rental properties in the city, a portfolio of tech investments, and a life insurance policy that we had discussed many times. We had planned our retirement together, dreaming of traveling through Europe once his health stabilized. Not much. It was impossible. Julian was a man of detail and precision. He would never leave me unprotected. He knew how his mother felt about me, that she viewed me as a common woman who had married up into her prestigious family. He had promised me that I would always be looked after, no matter what happened to him. As the sun began to rise, the grief in my heart started to turn into something sharper. I knew Beatrice was hiding something, and I knew she expected me to be too broken to fight back. She was very wrong. The next morning, I called Mr. Sterling, the family lawyer who had handled Julian's affairs for over 20 years. My hand was shaking as I held the phone to my ear, waiting for him to pick up. When the call finally connected, I asked him when we could meet to discuss Julian's will and the estate. There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line. "I'm afraid there is a complication, Eliana," Mr. Sterling said, his voice sounding uncharacteristically strained. "Mrs. Whitmore came to my office yesterday morning, just hours after the funeral. She claimed she had the authority to collect all of Julian's original documents, including the signed will." My blood ran cold as I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. Beatrice had moved faster than a predator. She had gone to the lawyer while I was still crying over Julian's clothes, stripping away my legal rights before I could even draw a breath. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Beatrice hadn't just made a comment about Julian leaving not much behind. She had actively stolen the proof of my future. She had taken his will before I even had the chance to process the fact that he was gone. For years, I had ignored her snide remarks about my background and her subtle hints that I wasn't Whitmore material. I had stayed polite for Julian's sake, wanting him to have a relationship with his mother. But now, with Julian gone, the mask had completely dropped. She wasn't just a difficult mother-in-law. She was a thief in expensive jewelry. She wanted to erase my 3 decades of marriage and cast me out into the street like an unwanted guest. I stood up and straightened my dress, feeling a cold fire ignite in my soul. If she wanted a war over Julian's legacy, I would give her one she'd never forget. I drove straight to the estate, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I found Beatrice in the study, the very room where Julian used to read to me by the fire. She was sitting at his desk, filing her nails, as if she owned the world. I didn't knock. I walked right in and demanded to know why she had taken the documents from Mr. Sterling. She didn't even look up at first. When she finally did, she offered a tight, fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. Julian wanted me to handle the heavy lifting, Eliana. You're far too emotional right now to deal with numbers and contracts, she said coolly. I told her I was his wife and his legal next of kin, but she just laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. She told me I should be grateful she was willing to help me pack. I realized then that she wasn't just being mean, she was being dangerous. That night, I stayed in the guest room because the master bedroom felt too lonely. Around midnight, I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. I peeked through the crack of the door and saw a shadow moving toward the library. It was Beatrice. She was carrying a flashlight and moving with a frantic energy that didn't match her usual calm. I followed her quietly, keeping my bare feet on the rugs to stay silent. I watched through the library door as she opened a hidden compartment in the antique desk. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope and clutched it to her chest like a prize. Her face was twisted with a look of pure greed that made my skin crawl. She tucked the envelope deep inside a locked drawer and turned the key. I realized that envelope was likely the original will. She wasn't just handling things. She was burying the truth where she thought I would never find it. I went back to bed, but sleep was impossible. I kept thinking about all the years she had spent looking down at me. She always said I married for comfort, and that I didn't understand the weight of the Whitmore name. I used to think her disdain was just because of our different social classes. I thought her anger would stop at words and cold glares during Thanksgiving dinner. I was wrong. Her hatred went much deeper than that. She wanted to see me lose everything Julian had built for us. She wanted to prove that I was nothing without him. As I lay there in the dark, I realized she had been planning this since the moment Julian got sick. She hadn't been visiting him in the hospital out of love. She had been scouting her territory. If you want to see how I take back my life from this monster, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. The next morning, I tried to call Mr. Sterling again. I needed him to tell me exactly what Beatrice had taken and what legal steps I could take to get the papers back. But when the secretary answered, her voice sounded small and frightened. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, but Mr. Sterling has gone on an indefinite leave of absence, she whispered. I asked when he would be back, and she said she didn't know. She told me he had cleared out his desk yesterday evening and left no forwarding address. My stomach twisted into a painful knot. Beatrice had money and connections that I couldn't even imagine. Had she paid him off? Or had she threatened him? The only person who could have helped me legally was gone, leaving me alone in a house that was starting to feel like a prison. The walls seemed to be closing in as I realized how deep this trap went. I went to a local cafe to clear my head, and that's where I ran into Sarah, a longtime family friend of the Whitmores. She looked around nervously before sitting down at my table. She leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. Eliana, you need to be careful. I heard Beatrice talking at the club yesterday. She's already started the process of transferring Julian's commercial assets into her own holding company. I felt the air leave my lungs. Sarah grabbed my hand, her eyes full of pity. She's telling everyone you were just a temporary part of his life. Do you have proof you were even legally married? She's telling people the marriage was never filed correctly. I told her that was ridiculous. We had been married for 30 years. But Sarah's face remained grave. Check your records, Eliana. Beatrice has friends in the county clerk's office. If she wants you gone, she'll make you disappear from the history books. I rushed back to the estate, my mind racing through every drawer and cabinet we owned. I knew exactly where our marriage certificate should be. It lived in a heavy metal safe in Julian's home office, tucked between our first home deed and the life insurance policy. I punched in the code with trembling fingers, but when the heavy door swung open, my heart stopped. The velvet-lined shelf where our most important memories lived was completely bare. Not just the certificate, but our wedding photos and Julian's old letters were gone. Beatrice had cleaned out the safe while I was at the funeral. I sank to the floor, feeling the cold marble against my skin. She was trying to unmake my life, piece by piece, as if the last 30 years had never happened. Without that paper, and with Mr. Sterling missing, I was becoming a ghost in my own home. I realized then that Beatrice wasn't just greedy. She was trying to delete me. By the end of the week, the phone started ringing with calls I didn't want to answer. It was Julian's cousins and old business associates. Their voices weren't full of sympathy anymore. They were sharp and accusing. Beatrice had been busy making her rounds at the country club and over lunch dates. She was telling anyone who would listen that I was a gold digger who had pressured Julian into a marriage he never really wanted. She told them that Julian had realized his mistake in his final weeks and had moved all his money back to the family estate to keep it away from me. "She's saying you were cut out of the will for a reason, Eliana," one cousin told me before hanging up. I sat in the dark living room, listening to the clock tick. The woman was a master of lies. She was poisoning the well, making sure that when she finally kicked me out, no one would be left to catch me. The following Tuesday, a man in a crisp suit knocked on the front door. He didn't look like a friend or a mourner. He handed me a thick manila envelope without saying a word. Inside was a formal bank notice from the institution that held the mortgage on our beloved estate. My eyes blurred as I read the bold text, "Notice of Ownership Transfer." The document stated that the title had been moved into a private trust controlled entirely by Beatrice Whitmore. My name had been scrubbed from the records as a co-owner. She had used a power of attorney I didn't even know existed to sign my rights away while Julian was still in a coma. I stood on the porch, clutching the paper, watching the man drive away. The house that Julian and I had filled with laughter and love for 3 decades was no longer mine. I was officially a squatter in my own life, and the clock was ticking down to 0. I collapsed on the sofa and cried until my eyes were swollen shut and my throat was raw. The betrayal was so heavy I could barely breathe. I felt like a fool for ever trusting Beatrice to have a shred of human decency. As the moon rose, I sat in the silent kitchen, staring at my laptop. Suddenly, a memory flickered in the back of my mind. 2 weeks before Julian died, he had sent me a strange, short email. It had no subject line, just a string of random characters and a link to a private cloud drive. At the time, I was so focused on his medication that I had barely glanced at it. I scrolled back through my inbox, my fingers flying over the keys. I found it. My breath hitched as I clicked the link and entered the password Julian had given me. This was the only place Beatrice's long reach couldn't touch. My pulse began to quicken as the screen loaded a single, encrypted file. The screen flickered, and then Julian's face appeared in a video recording. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp and full of a love that felt like a warm blanket around my shoulders. "Eliana, my love," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "If you are watching this, it means I'm gone, and my mother has likely started her games. I know her better than she thinks. I know she will try to hide the will and take the house." He took a deep breath, looking directly into the camera. "I hid a backup plan. If Mom gets to the original will before you can secure it, you must find a man named Mr. Hayes. He isn't part of the big firm. He's an old friend from law school who works out of a quiet office. He has the real truth, Eliana. He knows everything Beatrice has done." I reached out and touched the screen, tears blurring my vision. Julian had known. He had spent his final days building a fortress to protect me. Julian's face stayed on the screen for a moment longer, his eyes filled with a warning. "Hayes has the files she thinks were shredded," he whispered. "He has proof of the accounts she tried to drain while I was sick. Go to him, Eliana. Do not wait." The video cut to black, and the room felt colder than before. I didn't stay to cry this time. I grabbed my coat and my keys. My husband had reached out from beyond the grave to give me a sword to fight with. I realized Beatrice had spent her life thinking Julian was under her thumb, but he had spent his last months outsmarting her. She thought she had erased our history, but Julian had moved it into the shadows where she couldn't reach. I felt a surge of energy I hadn't felt since his heart stopped beating. The hunt for justice was finally starting, and I wouldn't stop until she was exposed. I found the address for Mr. Hayes in a dusty corner of the city, far away from the tall glass buildings where Beatrice's friends worked. His office was small, tucked between a bakery and a tailor. When I walked in, An older man with thick glasses looked up from a mountain of paperwork. When I said my name, he stood up so fast his chair hit the wall. He locked the front door and pulled the blinds shut. "I've been waiting for you, Eliana," he whispered, his voice shaky. "Beatrice came here a week ago. She didn't know I was Julian's friend. She tried to bribe me to hand over his private files. When I refused, she used her influence to force me to resign from the local board. She ruined my reputation in a single afternoon." He looked tired, but his jaw was set with a quiet, burning anger. But I kept a copy of the truth. She didn't win. Mr. Hayes walked over to a heavy filing cabinet and pulled out a plain, unmarked envelope. He slid it across the wooden desk toward me. My hands shook as I pulled out the crisp, white pages inside. It was the real will, signed and notched with a gold seal that looked like a shield. "He left everything to you, Eliana," Mr. Hayes said firmly. "The properties, the investments, and the main Whitmore estate." He even included a specific clause stating that his mother was to have no control over his assets due to her history of financial manipulation. I read the words over and over, Julian's signature looking bold and brave on the final page. He hadn't just left me money. He had left me a message that I was the only one he trusted. Beatrice's comfort comment was a lie. Julian had seen her greed clearly, and he had built a wall between her and our life. I stared at the notary stamp and the date on the document. It was dated only a month before his passing. It was undeniable proof that Beatrice's story was a complete fabrication. "She has been forging his signature on transfer deeds," Mr. Hayes explained, showing me a second set of papers. "She thinks that by the time you find a lawyer, the money will be gone into offshore accounts where you can't touch it." I felt a wave of nausea, then a wave of cold, hard focus. She wasn't just hiding a will. She was actively stealing millions of dollars every single hour I sat in that house grieving. If you want to see the moment the police finally walk into that mansion, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. I looked at Mr. Hayes and told him we needed to move fast. The Queen was sitting on her throne, but the floor was about to give way beneath her. We didn't waste a single second. Mr. Hayes helped me make 3 certified duplicates of every document in the envelope. We drove to the estate registrar's office just minutes before they closed for the evening. My heart was thumping in my throat as the clerk stamped the papers, officially recording the will in the public record. This meant that any transfers Beatrice tried to make from this moment on would be flagged as fraudulent. We filed a lease pendens on the house, which meant she couldn't sell it or move the title again. By the time we walked out into the cool night air, the legal trap was set. Beatrice was at home, probably sipping her expensive tea and planning her next lie, totally unaware that the powerless widow had just reclaimed the entire kingdom. I went back to the house, parked my car, and walked inside with my head held high for the first time in weeks. The house was deathly quiet when I stepped inside. Beatrice was sitting in the parlor, the dim light of a single lamp making her look like a spider in the center of her web. She was sipping her favorite jasmine tea, a smug expression on her face that made my stomach churn. She didn't even look up as I entered. "You should move out by the weekend, Eliana," she said, her voice dripping with artificial kindness. "I've already hired a moving crew to clear out Julian's old things. It's better to do it quickly, don't you think?" I felt the weight of the certified documents in my bag, a secret weapon that was about to blow her world apart. I didn't get angry. I didn't shout. I just stood there, watching her enjoy a victory that wasn't hers. She thought I was a broken woman with nowhere to go, but I was the one holding all the cards now. I let out a soft, steady breath and leaned against the doorframe. I actually found myself smiling back at her, which clearly caught her off guard. Her teacup paused halfway to her mouth, and she narrowed her eyes at me. "You might want to hold off on packing my things, Beatrice," I said, my voice as calm as a summer lake. "In fact, you might want to start thinking about your own suitcase." She set the cup down with a sharp clink, her face reddening with a sudden flash of temper. She told me I was being delusional and that the house belonged to the Whitmore bloodline, not a passing fancy like me. I just tilted my head and walked toward the stairs. "Sleep well," I called back over my shoulder. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day for you." I could hear her huffing in indignation as I climbed the steps, but I didn't look back. The next morning, the sun rose bright and sharp. At exactly 9 o'clock, Beatrice's cell phone began to ring. She was in the breakfast nook, eating a croissant, when her face suddenly went pale. I stood in the doorway, watching as she answered. It was my new attorney, Mr. Hayes. His voice was loud enough that I could hear his firm, professional tone through the speaker. Mrs. Whitmore, I am calling to inform you that we have successfully filed the true last will and testament of Julian Whitmore, he stated. We will be unsealing the documents and reading them formally at 11 o'clock this morning in the main study. Beatrice gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. She tried to scream that Mr. Sterling had the only will, but Mr. Hayes simply hung up. The panic started to leak into her eyes, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The hour leading up to the reading was pure chaos. I stayed in the kitchen, listening to Beatrice losing her mind. I heard her shouting through the walls, her voice high and screechy as she called her various contacts, only to find that no one would help her. She was slamming drawers in the library, probably looking for the hidden envelope she had tucked away. I heard the sound of paper tearing and furniture being shoved across the floor. She was desperate, a cornered animal realizing the trap was closing. She thought she had destroyed every copy, but she hadn't counted on Julian's secret loyalty. Every slam of a door felt like a drumbeat for my own justice. When 11 o'clock finally struck, I walked into the study. Mr. Hayes was already there, holding a thick folder. Beatrice was standing by the window, her hair disheveled and her breathing ragged. The reckoning was finally here. The grand reckoning began the moment Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. He sat at the head of the long oak table, looking every bit the legal warrior Julian had promised he would be. He didn't look at Beatrice, he only looked at me. With a steady hand, he unfolded the heavy, cream-colored pages of the true will. The room felt heavy with anticipation, the air thick with the scent of old books and impending justice. This document, signed and witnessed by 2 independent parties, is the final wish of Julian Whitmore, Mr. Hayes announced. He began to read the cold, hard facts that Beatrice had tried so hard to bury. All assets, including the entirety of the Whitmore estate and all liquid investments, go to Mrs. Claire Eliana Whitmore, his wife and sole beneficiary. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For the first time in my life, I saw Beatrice's mouth go completely slack. She looked like she had been struck. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice stared at the documents on the table as if they were poisonous snakes. She tried to reach for her teacup, but her hand was shaking so violently that the china rattled against the saucer. Before she could take a sip, her grip failed. The teacup hit the polished mahogany table with a sickening crack, spilling dark liquid across the surface like an ink blot. She didn't even try to clean it up. She just sat there, gasping for air, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. The woman who had spent years making me feel small and insignificant was now crumbling right in front of me. She looked around the room as if searching for an escape, but there were no more shadows to hide in. The truth was out in the open, shining like a spotlight on her greed. She had tried to steal my life, but she had only succeeded in ruining her own. Suddenly, the silence broke. Beatrice let out a piercing scream that echoed through the high ceilings of the study. This is a lie. He was confused. He was on heavy medication, she shrieked, her finger pointing accusingly at me. I took care of him. I am his mother. He would never leave me with nothing. She looked like a madwoman, her expensive silk scarf hanging lopsided around her neck. Mr. Hayes didn't blink. He simply turned the page and read aloud a specific clause that Julian had insisted upon. Julian Whitmore, being in full mental capacity and under no duress, declare this my final will. I am aware of my mother's attempts to influence my decisions and hereby exclude her from all inheritance to protect my wife's future. Beatrice's voice died in her throat. The confused argument was dead before it even started. Julian had seen her coming a mile away, and he had documented his sanity to stop her. Beatrice tried to claim the signatures were fake, but Mr. Hayes was prepared for that, too. He stood up and opened the study door, gesturing for two men to enter. They were Julian's closest colleagues from the firm, men Beatrice had known for decades. They didn't look at her with the usual respect they once held. Instead, they looked at her with pure disgust. "We witnessed Julian sign this in his hospital room," the first man said firmly. He was as sharp as ever. The second man nodded, looking directly at Beatrice. "He made us sign after saying, 'My wife deserves security from the people who will try to hurt her once I'm gone.' He knew exactly what you would do, Beatrice." The weight of their testimony was the final nail in her coffin. She collapsed back into her chair, her eyes wide and hollow. She had lost her status, her money, and the respect of her son's peers all at once. The color drained from Beatrice's face until she looked like a marble statue of a defeated queen. "You tricked him," she whispered, her voice cracking with a mix of hate and despair. "You poisoned his mind against his own mother." I stood up slowly and walked to the other side of the table until I was standing right over her. I didn't feel the need to shout. I spoke softly, my voice filled with a peace that I hadn't felt since Julian died. "I didn't have to do anything, Beatrice. He prepared for you because he knew who you really were. He loved me because I was the only person in his life who didn't want anything from him but his heart." She flinched as if I had slapped her. The realization that her own son had spent his final days protecting his wife from her was a wound she couldn't hide. She was finally seeing that her power was an illusion. Mr. Hayes wasn't finished. He reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a second set of documents that were even more damaging. "This is a recorded property sale from 3 days ago," he said, sliding a ledger toward Beatrice. "It shows you attempted to sell the downtown rental properties to a shell company you own, using a forged signature of your late son." The air in the room became incredibly cold. Forgery was a serious crime, and we had the proof right there on the table. Beatrice's eyes darted toward the door, but it was too late to run. She had moved so fast to steal the assets that she had left a digital and physical trail of breadcrumbs. Julian's video had warned me she was eyeing the house papers for months, and Mr. Hayes had been tracking the bank movements the entire time. She had walked right into a legal minefield, and every step she took only made things worse. I turned on the television in the study, and the screen glowed with the video Julian had left for me. His voice filled the room, steady and clear. "I've watched my mother eye the house papers for months," Julian said on the screen. "She thinks she is subtle, but I see the greed. If she tries to claim I changed my mind, know that it is a lie." Gasps filled the room as Julian's colleagues watched the screen. Beatrice looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. The video was the ultimate betrayal to her, but to me, it was a shield. He even mentioned the specific offshore accounts she had tried to access while he was in his final weeks of life. Every word he spoke stripped another layer of dignity from her. She sat frozen, forced to listen to her own son describe her character to the very people she had spent years trying to impress with her fake perfection. The door opened quietly, and a man in a dark suit entered. He wasn't a lawyer, he was a detective from the white-collar crime unit. He had been standing in the hallway, listening to the entire reading. He held a small notebook and a pen, taking quiet notes as he looked at the forged signatures Mr. Hayes had presented. "Forgery and grand larceny are very serious charges, Mrs. Whitmore," the officer said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. Beatrice tried to speak, but only a small, pathetic squeak came out of her throat. The sight of the police note being written was the moment she realized this wasn't just a family argument anymore. This was a criminal matter. She had crossed a line that her name and money couldn't fix. The cold reality of prison time finally dawned on her, and the arrogant mask she had worn for 70 years finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. Word traveled fast. By that afternoon, the relatives who had shunned me were calling again. But this time, their voices were filled with shame and stuttered apologies. They had seen the news of the will being unsealed. They realized Beatrice had used them as pawns in her cruel game. One by one, they told me how sorry they were for believing her lies about me being a gold digger. I listened to their excuses, but I didn't offer them comfort. Shame was painted across their faces when they realized they had helped a thief attack a grieving widow. They had stood by while she tried to erase me, and now they had to live with the fact that I was the one holding the keys to the Whitmore legacy. I realized that justice wasn't just about the money. It was about the world finally seeing the truth about the woman they had all feared and admired. The local news picked up the story by the evening. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen: "Widow nearly robbed of her inheritance by socialite mother-in-law." The public exposure was the one thing Beatrice feared more than death itself. Her reputation in the community was destroyed in a single news cycle. People who had once bowed to her at the club were now whispering about her fraud in the grocery store aisles. If you want to see the final look on her face as she walks out of this house forever, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. The community she had ruled with an iron fist was now laughing at her downfall. She had tried to make me look like a villain, but she had only succeeded in making herself a cautionary tale. The prestige she had spent her whole life building was gone, replaced by the ugly truth of her own black heart. The final blow came the next morning. A court order was delivered to the front door, signed by a judge who had seen the evidence of the forgery. Beatrice was ordered to vacate the estate immediately. I stood on the grand staircase, watching as she was forced to pack her designer bags in a hurry. She moved like an old woman for the first time, her shoulders slumped and her hands shaking. Watching her fold her expensive silks while a police officer stood by the door was the closure that grief alone couldn't give me. She had tried to kick me out of my own home, and now she was the one being discarded. As she dragged her suitcase toward the front door, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The darkness she had brought into our lives was finally being pushed out into the light, where it belonged. The house felt lighter as Beatrice dragged her luggage toward the exit. Before she left, I walked into the study and approached the desk where I had seen her hiding things that night. I used a heavy letter opener to pry open the locked drawer she had been so protective of. Inside, I didn't find a hidden treasure, but I found the shredded remains of what she thought was the only will. I pulled out a handful of thin, white strips. Among the confetti, I found one piece that was still perfectly readable. It was a section of a fake document she had drafted herself. It read, "To my dear mother, who has always been my greatest light." I realized then how desperate she had been to create a reality that Julian never felt. She had literally tried to rewrite his heart with a paper shredder. I dropped the scraps into the trash, finally purging the last of her lies from my home. A week after the house was finally mine again, I met with Mr. Hayes to finalize the transition of Julian's assets. As I looked at the vast amount of wealth Julian had left to me, I knew I couldn't just sit on it. I decided to donate a significant portion of the inheritance to a legal aid fund specifically for widows who were being bullied by powerful families. I wanted to make sure that no other woman had to feel the terror I felt when I thought I was alone. It felt like the right tribute to Julian's memory, using his success to protect others, just as he had protected me from beyond the grave. The donation made the front page of the city paper, further cementing the difference between my character and Beatrice's. It was a legacy built on kindness, not on the cold, calculated greed that had defined the Whitmore name for so long. 1 month later, I received a call from the detention center. Beatrice was awaiting her trial and had requested to see me one last time. I went, not out of pity, but for finality. She sat behind the glass, looking thin and gray, her jewelry gone and her pride replaced by a bitter, trembling rage. "He always loved me more," she hissed, her voice cracking as she pressed her hand against the glass. "You were just a distraction. He belonged to me." I looked at her and felt nothing but a distant kind of compassion for a woman so empty. "If he loved you more, Beatrice, then why did he trust me and not you?" I asked gently. She had no answer. She just stared at me with hollow eyes as I stood up and walked away. I left her there in the silence of her own making, a queen with no kingdom and no son. When I got home, I sat in Julian's chair and opened the cloud drive one last time. I scrolled past the legal warnings and the financial data until I found a file I hadn't seen before. It was the final page of his video message, recorded just hours before he slipped into his final sleep. "Claire, my Eliana," he said, his voice a soft, beautiful whisper. Don't let her take what I built for us. You earned this life through your patience and your love. You are the only real Whitmore I ever knew. I closed my laptop and let the tears fall, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of victory. He had given me the tools to fight, but more importantly, he had given me the permission to be happy without him. I was no longer the woman hiding in the corner of a funeral. I was a woman standing in the light. Justice is a quiet thing when it finally arrives. Beatrice had hidden the will, thinking she could erase 30 years of my life with a single flick of her wrist. She thought she could turn me into a footnote in her own grand story. But she was wrong. When the lawyer called my name, it wasn't just a signature he read aloud to the room. It was justice resurrected from the shadows. I looked out the window at the gardens Julian and I had planted together, and I knew that every flower would bloom this spring. I wasn't a gold digger, a passing fancy, or a settle-for wife. I was Eliana Whitmore, the woman Julian loved enough to protect from the grave. She tried to bury the truth, but she forgot that truth is a seed. When you try to bury it, it only grows back stronger. I am finally, truly home. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more powerful revenge stories.